This is the Žižek Dictionary entry for subject by Rex Butler. In his recently published Less Than Nothing, Žižek analyzes a well-known joke from American sitcoms. It involves one of the characters looking at a car being towed away and laughing until they realize that it is actually their car. It is a joke repeated every time we catch an unfamiliar glimpse of ourselves in the bathroom mirror and are horrified before we remember it is us. In both cases, says Žižek, we do not recognize ourselves, but we are this misrecognition. It is in this delay between seeing and recognizing that the subject is experienced in its purest form, and even in which the subject comes about. As Žižek writes, the Lacanian thesis is that this delay is structural. There is no direct self-acquaintance. The self is empty. The title, Less Than Nothing, is meant to refer to what allows appearance, but it can also be seen to refer to the subject. The subject is not something, some substantive, intact, really existing entity, but neither is it nothing. It is rather, at once, more than something, that for which appearance stands in, and, less than nothing, able to be seen only through appearance. The self is less than nothing insofar as we are unable to match it with itself, insofar as what the experience of the subject reveals is not nothing, but an endless drive towards nothing. An obstinate, repetitive fixation on a contingent object that subtracts the subject from its direct immersion in reality. But to begin at the beginning. Žižek came later to criticize his first English-language book, The Sublime Object of Ideology, for its liberal democratic politics, but already there was the critical break with the relativist pragmatism that he regards as the equivalent of this democracy. That is to say, already in Sublime Object, there is a distance from the usual historicist, Foucault, or deconstructive, Derrida, doing away with of the subject, in which the subject is shown to be an illusion produced by wider social or linguistic forces. But also for Žižek, there the subject is not a unified, self-conscious agent that is able to act freely to accomplish rationally determined goals, as in certain kinds of analytic philosophy. On the contrary, Žižek's real point is that both of these approaches to the subject, for all their seeming opposition, are the same. The subject in both is still understood to be whole or complete. The only difference is whether it is self-caused or brought about by outside forces. In one way, the materialist critique of the subject, for all of its apparent dispersal of identity, merely puts the subject elsewhere. If the human is no longer a subject, then the social or linguistic conditions producing it are. Žižek breaks with both idealist and materialist approaches in offering an essentially psychoanalytic conception of the subject. Following the insight of Freud and, after him, Lacan, the subject is neither intact nor simply erased, but divided. However, to return to what we began by speaking of here, it is not some pre-existing subject that is divided, but this division that is the subject. The subject is what, and here we can begin to see the possibility of taking into account a whole variety of things that are not usually considered a subject, is divided from itself. It is the division of something from itself that makes it a subject, or that is the effect of a subject. We see this in Žižek's most direct statement on the subject, the introduction to the book The Ticklish Subject, which begins with a defense of Descartes' cogito against all those tendencies in contemporary philosophy that think they go beyond it. However, Žižek sees in the cogito not any kind of self-reflection by which the I grasps itself, but only the permanent impossibility of reconciling the I that speaks and the I that is spoken of. It is Descartes, in a revolution carried on first by Kant and then by the German idealists, who sees in the I a force of destruction, an empty space beyond all ideological fixity, a negative power whose withdrawal from reality also opens up the space for its symbolic reconstitution. There are perhaps two accounts of the birth of the subject in Žižek's work, rarely put together but offering many intriguing parallels. The first is the now famous analysis of ideological interpellation in The Sublime Object of Ideology, in terms of Lacan's three registers of the imaginary, symbolic, and real. Of course, it can be seen as though in the imaginary register, in which the subject believes they look at themselves in a mirror, or are called by the other, the subject already exists. But it is this imaginary relationship to the other that actually leads to the self being reflected or called. At the same time, the other important aspect of Žižek's analysis is that this ideological appeal works not just through the imaginary and symbolic registers, through either the image or language, but through its incomprehensibility or enunciation in the register of the real. The subject comes about through their very doubt or uncertainty as to what the other wants, which Žižek glosses by the phrase "che vuoi," or "what do you want from me?" In fact, it is through this real that we feel most compelled, and, if it is the last of the registers that Žižek considers, it also comes first, underlying, and making possible all of the others. It is this irreducible real that inaugurates identification at the beginning and remains over after identification at the end. No proper ideological analysis can remain at the levels of the imaginary and symbolic, but will find in the real, in the apparently nonsensical, pre-ideological kernel of enjoyment, the secret operation of ideology, the most profound way in which we are inducted into language and the symbolic and made into docile and obedient subjects. The other account of the birth of the subject, perhaps only slightly more mythical, is to be found in Žižek's The Indivisible Remainder. It is a discussion of the 19th century German idealist F.W.J. Schelling, and particularly his book Die Weltalter, or The Ages of the World, which describes the genesis of the universe and the coming into being of God. Schelling describes there a process in a way the reverse of the one described above, whereby a primordial rotary motion of the drives, which is caught up in an endless cycle of contraction and expansion, is finally broken by the divine Word of God, by which he posits himself. It is, Žižek says, the kind of real broken by the symbolic. We pass from nature to culture through the actions of a free subject who self-differentiates, or contracts his being outside himself. But in another way, all of this is only a retrospective construction or a kind of fantasy. Even this story of a primordial decision undertaken by God is relatable only after it has been made. A certain subject or better subjectivity results from the breaking of the chains of necessity by the pronouncing of the divine word, but there is also necessarily implied a pure subjective decision to do so. As Žižek says, the subject in Schelling is a vanishing mediator, a necessary gap in the passage from nature to culture that is erased in the very transformation it makes possible. In both accounts of the subject, a total symbolic order is produced. It is a symbolic outside of which there is nothing. In ideological interpellation, a cynical or critical distance onto the symbolic is how the symbolic works. In Schelling, the real that precedes the symbolic is a kind of myth, recuperable only through the symbolic. It is just this insight that the second draft of Weltalter realizes, which the first draft is not yet at and the third draft retreats from. But what must be understood is that this symbolic order, in which the subject has its place, is possible only because of a certain subject, or is the expression of a certain subjectivity for which it stands in. Although the subject is always symbolically determined, there is a freedom that allows this determination. There is a necessary moment of doubt. And this is what Lacan is getting at with his distinction between enunciation and enunciated in Descartes' cogito, that we must traverse in order to attain certainty. And within the symbolic order, there are signs, or symptoms, Lacan calls them objets petits a, that point to this fact. Thus, in the Lacanian formula for fantasy, Bard est vis-a-vis a, there is posited a relationship between the pure void of the subject and the formless remainder of the real, which resists subjectivization. And an example Žižek gives of this fantasy at stake in the symbolic is the final conclusion that one is wearing a white hat in Lacan's essay, Logical Time and the Assertion of Anticipated Certainty, insofar as it reveals that identity is always both too soon and too late, that once we attempt to preempt uncertainty by assuming an identity, and it is only from the position of identity that we can look back and see this uncertainty. The subject in everyday society is alienated, divided from itself, able to dream of unity only through a fantasy object like objet petit a. But there are perhaps authentic experiences of subjectivity, answering the question "Je vois," in what Žižek calls the act. In the act, we do not follow a pre-existing symbolic mandate, but redefine the very contours of what is possible, so that it creates retrospectively the conditions of its own possibility. The act neither simply breaks with the symbolic, nor merely returns us to the symbolic, but rather aims to install a new symbolic order. It forces us to re-experience the introduction of the symbolic and thus to confront its contingency. What is realized in the act is the fact that, against the idea that the subject is a creation of the symbolic depends on the subject. There is therefore a kind of split introduced into the symbolic order. In the act, there is no relying on the authority of a subject or any transparent self-reflection by the subject in a non-alienated fashion. On the contrary, it dispenses with the illusion that there is a subject, or at least a self-conscious and self-possessed subject that knows the effects of its actions in advance. We return to that primordial experience of the subject as empty, as a moment of doubt and uncertainty. Or the act is the subject in Lacan's sense that I am not where I think, and I am where I do not think, which is precisely the aim of Žižek's theoretical act of analysis, to stop us thinking, or at least stop us thinking in ways that are recognizable to ourselves.